Welcome to episode 24 of Directed by Steven Spielberg. Today's film is a return to the historical drama genre for Spielberg with the 2005 film Munich starring Eric Bana. I had heard of this film for a long time but have never seen it before and literally knew nothing about it. So going in, I was excited to experience essentially a brand new Spielberg film for the first time. What did I think of the film? Let's find out. Munich is a historical thriller that dramatizes the events following the tragic 1972 Munich Olympics, where 11 Israeli athletes were killed by the Palestinian terrorist group Black September. The film focuses on the aftermath of this event, particularly Israel's covert retaliation. The story follows Avner Kaufman, played by Eric Bana, a Mossad agent chosen to lead a secret mission to hunt down and assassinate those responsible for planning the Munich massacre. Avner, who leaves behind his pregnant wife, is given a list of targets spread across Europe and is provided with a team of operatives. Steve, a driver, Hans, a document forger, Robert, a bomb maker, and Karl, a cleanup man. As the team travels across Europe, they meticulously track down and eliminate their targets, often facing moral dilemmas and questioning the ethics of their mission. The assassinations are depicted as tense and complex, with each kill taking a toll on the team members, both mentally and emotionally. The line between justice and revenge blurs as Avner and his team become increasingly paranoid and isolated, haunted by the violence they perpetrate. The film explores the psychological impact of their mission, as Avner begins to question whether their actions are making the world safer or perpetuating a cycle of violence. The mission ultimately leaves Avner disillusioned and alienated, unsure of whether the loss and suffering were justified. The end. Given the incredible and true events of this film, you would think that I would have a lot to say about it. But the truth is, there isn't a whole lot to speak of. Regardless, I'll start with the technical aspects of the film. Starting off, Spielberg lights are used once again, mainly in enclosed spaces. It's definitely toned down compared to some of Spielberg's recent films at this point in his career, but nevertheless, they're still present. He uses a lot of handheld cameras, particularly for those chaotic scenes in hallways and stairwells where aggressive actions are taking place. This helps place the viewer in the scene and to experience the intensity of the situation at a greater level. He also employs a somewhat new technique in this film, which is the use of the low-angle shot, angling upwards at our characters and scenery. This was mainly used in those street-level scenes in various European cities, and I believe this was done to specifically capture the beauty and architecture of those cities as a way of taking the audience on a tour through those gorgeous settings. There is no doubt that Munich is a beautifully shot film, and Spielberg deserves full credit for the technical execution on display. On a thematic level, the film's premise presents another great central dilemma, much like some of Spielberg's early thousands films. In Munich, the macro dilemma revolves around the land rights issue between Israelis and Palestinians, whilst the more specific dilemma is about the concept of serving one's country and if carrying out these acts of murder against bad people actually makes the world a safer place. Regarding the former, Spielberg steers relatively clear of answering any sort of land rights debate within the context of the film, which is admirable of Spielberg considering his Jewish heritage. Instead, he opts to hear both sides of the argument as evidenced in the scene between Avner and a Palestinian. As a compromise, he hones in on the latter, which by default illustrates the true nature of the land rights debate by showing how governments embolden individuals to carry out missions for their country whilst undertaking actions elsewhere that contradict the individual's mission. Avner is tasked with eliminating the terrorists responsible for the murder of 11 Israeli athletes, and he believes he is doing so as a patriot and for the betterment of the world at large. What he discovers in the process, however, is that his own government utilizes their enemies for political means, and that the mission he carries out is only feeding into a cycle of violence with no end in sight. Case in point when he returns home and is branded a hero by his fellow patriots, yet he feels more disillusioned than ever and suffers greatly from his own PTSD. The ending of the film summarizes this perfectly, as Avner questions Ephraim about his mission and what he's been fighting for this whole time. When Avner asks Ephraim to come to his home to break bread and Ephraim declines, this is symbolic of and somewhat conclusive of both sides' refusal to reconcile, meaning the war will go on forever because they choose to, or worse, because they wanted to. Whilst the film explores these themes quite well, my issues with Munich rest mostly with the character development. Spielberg is normally known for efficiently introducing his characters and plot, getting us to know everything we need about them in as little time as possible so that we can invest in the events for the rest of the film. While Spielberg introduces Abner and his wife decently well, the others who comprise the main team are never really fleshed out, and the film treats them as somewhat of an afterthought despite being central to the plot progression. The layout for the mission in the first act is sort of convoluted and difficult to follow. With so many names thrown into the mix, it left me confused quite early on and playing catch-up for most of the film. A perfect example is Daniel Craig's character Steve, who is the last man standing from Avner's team, but just sort of disappears from the film at the end, without any resolution. Particularly when his fellow team members are being executed one by one, it seems strange that he's just sort of forgotten at the end. But this is fitting for a film that juggles too many characters that we ultimately don't get to know, and thus invest in. The character that is most fleshed out is unsurprisingly Avner Kaufman, played superbly by Eric Bana, turning in a compelling lead performance that takes Avner from an optimistic patriot to a paranoid veteran. All of the cast are exceptional with the material they're given, some of the standouts being Jeffrey Rush as Ephraim and Ciaran Hinds as Carl. There is much to appreciate about Munich as a film, and it does succeed on many levels, but what prevents it from being a masterpiece is that it wants to be a character-driven film, but instead focuses much more on being plot-driven, and the characters suffer slightly as a result. When I consider how this film places within Spielberg's filmography to this point in his career, Munich is one of his few films to not have an explicitly happy ending, or at least reach some sort of equilibrium. In fact, I would go as far as to say that Munich is by far his most pessimistic film to date. This is fitting of the subject matter, and it shows that Spielberg is capable of telling a darker story that doesn't end happily, something that he was criticized for throughout his career by those who felt he always leaned towards the happier endings in films when they sometimes didn't warrant it. I always felt this was an unfair assessment, as his films always conveyed difficult journeys for their protagonists, but still thoroughly believe in the hopefulness of the human spirit, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just like there's nothing wrong with conveying the bleak reality of the story in Munich. Overall, Munich tells the story of this team of Mossad agents quite well and provides a commentary on the Middle East conflict that remains relevant to this day and will unfortunately most likely remain relevant for many years to come. So there you have it, another episode of Directed by Steven Spielberg in the bag. Technically speaking, Munich is sublime, producing visuals that emphasize the intensity of the situation. From a story perspective, however, I felt it left a lot to be desired, particularly when it came to the characters, which I felt were underdeveloped from the get-go. For that, I'm going to give Munich a 7.5 out of 10. At this stage, there is a number of 7.5s out of 10 on my list so far, and I personally am going to place Munich in 19th place at the bottom of them. That concludes today's episode, and looking ahead to the next is a return to the familiar for Spielberg with the 2008 film Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of Crystal Skull, the belated entry in the Indiana Jones series. I personally have more positive thoughts on this film than most, and I look forward to expressing them to you in the next coming episode. Until then, I thank you all very much for watching, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.